July 1974. A summer night in Memphis. Elvis Presley pulls out a Colt 45 and fires 2 shots into his car. This is one of the most absurd scenes in 20th century automotive history. But the story you're about to hear is far more insane than 2 bullets. The man who built this car was named Alejandro de Tomaso. He wasn't Italian. He was the heir to an Argentine cattle empire. He was a Formula One driver, and he was a wanted man. The night he fled Argentina in 1955, he carried nothing but an Italian passport. 20 years later, he had married an American heiress. He had built a car that kept Ferrari awake at night. And then, he bought Maserati. A man exiled by his own country. In 30 years, rewrote the entire history of Italian automotive industry. This is the story of Alejandro de Tomaso. Buenos Aires, 1955. To understand why Alejandro de Tomaso ran, you have to understand what he was running from. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't failure. It was something far more dangerous. He had made the wrong enemy. Alejandro was born in 1928 into one of the most powerful families in Argentina. His father, a government minister. His mother, heir to a cattle empire so large you couldn't cross it in a single day. By the time Alejandro was 20, he was running ranches the size of small countries. He had everything. He should have been untouchable. But Alejandro had a secret. He had made an enemy of the man who ruled his country. His name was Juan Perón. In 1955, Perón didn't just rule Argentina. He owned it. The press answered to him. The military answered to him. And anyone who didn't vanished. Alejandro printed an underground newspaper against him. For 2 years, he got away with it. Then, in June 1955, he made a choice that would cost him his country. He joined a group of officers planning to end Perón's rule. It failed. The names began to surface. Friends vanished overnight. Alejandro had hours, not days. Hours. He didn't pack. He didn't say goodbye. He took one document, an Italian passport, inherited from a grandfather he had never met, and ran. 2 days later, he stood on the deck of a ship leaving Buenos Aires harbor. He was 27 years old. He would never see Argentina again. When the ship docked in Genoa, the man who walked off had nothing. No country, no money, no name anyone in Italy recognized. But he had one thing the Italians might pay for. He could drive. And in 1955, in a small city called Modena, driving was the only thing that mattered. Modena, 1955. A small city in northern Italy. Population less than 200,000. But in 1955, Modena had something no other city on earth had. It built the fastest cars in the world. Ferrari was here. Maserati was here. Oscar was here. If you could turn a wrench in Modena, you could feed your family. If you could drive, you could become a god. Alejandro de Tomaso walked into Modena with no money, no contacts, and a name nobody had heard of. He was 27. He had been the heir to a cattle empire 72 hours earlier. Now, he was looking for work. He found it at Maserati. Not as an executive, not as a designer, as a mechanic. 80,000 lire a month. Translated to today's money, about $400. The man who had once managed ranches the size of small countries was now under a Maserati 250F, tightening bolts for 40 hours a week. Remember that number. 80,000 lire. 20 years from now, That number will become the cruelest joke in this entire story. But Alejandro didn't see a punishment. He saw a door. Maserati had a racing team. The racing team needed test drivers. Test drivers, in Modena, were how mechanics became somebody. Within 18 months, Alejandro wasn't tightening bolts. He was driving the cars he used to fix. Within 3 years, he had his own seat at the 1956 Buenos Aires Grand Prix, the same city he had run from in the middle of the night. He came back through the front gate in a racing suit, wearing the colors of Maserati. He won his class. The Argentine government did not arrest him. They didn't dare. He was no longer a fugitive. He was an Italian racing driver. That was when she walked into his life. Her name was Isabel Haskell. She was American. She was 26. She had grown up in a New Jersey mansion, surrounded by oil money and East Coast society. She had also just bought a racing car from Maserati. Because, and this is the part nobody tells you about Isabel, she didn't come to Modena to spectate. She came to drive. In 1957, Isabel Haskell was one of the only women in the world racing professionally against men. And she was good. In 1958, at Sebring, 12 hours of endurance racing in the Florida heat, Isabel and Alejandro shared a car. They won their class. A few months later, they were married. She started signing her name Isabella, the Italian version. He started going by Alessandro, the Italian version. Two people from two different continents, both quietly erasing where they came from. Because in Modena, the past didn't matter. Only the next race did. But Isabella didn't just bring a husband to Modena. She brought something Alejandro had lost the night he fled Argentina. She brought money. And in 1959, with his wife's family fortune behind him, a man who had walked into Modena with nothing opened his own factory. He called it De Tomaso Automobili. The exiled mechanic was about to start building his own cars. And the first one would declare war on Carroll Shelby. By 1965, Alejandro de Tomaso had built something small but real. A factory. A name. A handful of race cars that nobody bought. He needed a partner, and in 1965, the most powerful man in American racing was looking at Modena. His name was Carroll Shelby, a Texan, a former chicken farmer, a former Le Mans winner. The man who had taken a cheap British roadster, dropped a Ford V8 into it, and built the most feared sports car on Earth. He called it the Cobra. Remember that name. Shelby and De Tomaso met. They shook hands. They agreed to build a race car together. It was supposed to be the partnership of the decade. A Texan with American money, an Argentine with Italian engineering. Together, they were going to take on Ferrari. The car was called the P70. It was supposed to change everything. It changed nothing. Because in 1965, somewhere between the contracts and the prototypes, Shelby and De Tomaso had a fight. We don't know what the fight was about. There are no recordings, no letters, no reliable witnesses. What we know is what happened next. The partnership collapsed. Shelby walked out of Modena. He never came back. For most men, that would have been the end. A failed deal, a wasted year, a lesson learned. But Alejandro de Tomaso wasn't most men. He had been humiliated by his own country once. He had survived it. He wasn't about to be humiliated again by a chicken farmer from Texas. So he did something nobody expected. He started designing a new car. Not a partnership car. His car. He hired a young designer from Turin, a kid named Giorgetto Giugiaro. You may know that name. In 10 years, Giugiaro would design the DeLorean. But in 1966, he was 28 years old, and he was about to draw the most aggressive Italian sports car of the decade. Steel monocoque chassis, mid-engine V8, gull-wing rear hatches that lifted to expose the entire engine bay. A car so low you could put your elbow on the roof. It was a masterpiece. And then, Alejandro named it. He didn't give it a number. He didn't give it a place name. He gave it a word in Italian, Mangusta. In English, mongoose. The mongoose is a small predator. It has one defining trait. It is the only animal on Earth that hunts and kills cobras. And Carroll Shelby's car was called the Cobra. Every journalist in Italy understood the message instantly. This wasn't a car. This was an open declaration of war. Alejandro de Tomaso had named his entire revenge into the metal. The Mangusta debuted in 1966 at the Turin Motor Show. It made Shelby's Cobra look old. It made everything look old. And on the other side of the Atlantic, sitting in Dearborn, Michigan, one man was watching very closely. Henry Ford II. He had just lost his own war with Ferrari at Le Mans. He was looking for an Italian who knew how to humiliate his enemies. He had just found one. In 1969, Henry Ford II was a humiliated man. For 4 years, he had poured millions of dollars into beating Ferrari at Le Mans. He had finally done it. The Ford GT40 had crushed Ferrari in 1966, 67, 68, and 69. But Ford didn't want to win Le Mans. He wanted what Ferrari had. He wanted a road car. An Italian road car. A supercar with a Ford badge on it that could sit in a Lincoln-Mercury showroom in Detroit. He needed an Italian builder who hated Ferrari as much as he did. There was exactly one man who fit that description. A phone rang in Modena. Imagine for a moment that you are Alejandro de Tomaso. 14 years ago, you stepped off a ship in Genoa with nothing. Today, the most powerful man in the American auto industry is on the other end of your telephone, asking you to build him a supercar. You say yes. Of course you say yes. In 1971, the De Tomaso Pantera was born. It was a strange machine. The chassis, Italian. The engine, a Ford 351 Cleveland V8 shipped from Ohio. The transmission, German, from ZF. The body, designed by an American working in Modena. It was a car with no nationality. A car built by an Argentine, an American, an Italian, and a German. All at once. And then Ford did something audacious. He put the Pantera in Lincoln-Mercury dealerships, right next to the family sedans. For under $10,000, an American could walk into a dealership in Ohio and drive home in an Italian mid-engine supercar. It should have been the deal of the century. 5,000 cars sold in 3 years. But underneath the sales numbers, something was wrong. The early Panteras were a disaster. The body panels were filled with putty. The wiring melted in summer traffic. The cooling systems failed at highway speed. Ford engineers tested one of the first Panteras at their proving ground in Michigan. It overheated and broke down on Ford's own track. Henry Ford II was not amused, but Alejandro had already moved on. He didn't want to just build cars for other people. He wanted his own racing team. In 1970, the same year Pantera was preparing for launch, Alejandro entered Formula One. He partnered with a young British team owner named Frank Williams. Yes, that Frank Williams. The car was called the De Tomaso 505. The driver was a 28-year-old Englishman named Piers Courage, heir to a brewing fortune, movie star handsome, best friend of Jackie Stewart. He was supposed to be the future of British motorsport. The third race of the season was at Zandvoort in the Netherlands. Lap 23. The De Tomaso 505 left the track at high speed and burst into flames. Piers Courage did not get out. He was 28 years old. The fire was so intense that for 2 days nobody could confirm what had happened to the man inside. Frank Williams never raced a De Tomaso again. Alejandro never raced in Formula One again. And in Detroit, Henry Ford II was reading the newspapers. A dead driver, a failing supercar, an Italian partner who couldn't keep his factory running on time. In 1974, Ford pulled out. The contracts were ended. The Lincoln-Mercury dealers stopped selling the Pantera, and the Ford badge, the badge that had been promised on every car coming out of Modena, was quietly removed. Alejandro de Tomaso kept building Panteras until 1992, but his name on those cars was never the same again. By the mid-1970s, Alejandro de Tomaso was no longer a refugee. He was a hunter. While Ford was packing up its Lincoln-Mercury contracts, Alejandro was quietly buying Italy. In 1968, he had taken control of Ghia, Italy's most legendary design house. In 1969, he absorbed Vignale, another design legend. In 1971, he bought Benelli, one of Italy's oldest motorcycle makers. Then Moto Guzzi. Then Innocenti, the company that built the Italian version of the Mini. In 6 years, an Argentine exile had bought 5 of Italy's most historic industrial names, but none of those were the prize. The prize was sitting in a factory 2 kilometers from his own. A factory bleeding money. A factory whose foreign owner had just gone bankrupt. A factory the Italian government was desperate to save. Maserati. In 1975, the French automaker Citroën, which had owned Maserati for the previous 7 years, collapsed under the weight of an oil crisis it could not survive. Maserati was about to die. The Italian government called an emergency meeting. They needed someone, anyone, to take Maserati off Citroën's hands and keep the factory open. They had one candidate. He was Argentine. He had no money of his own. He had bought half of Italian industry on borrowed credit and his wife's family fortune. But he was the only person on earth who wanted Maserati badly enough to fight for it. And he wanted it for a reason nobody in that government meeting fully understood. 20 years earlier, in 1955, a young exile had walked into the Maserati factory looking for work. They had given him a job under one of their racing cars. They had paid him 80,000 lire a month, about $400 in today's money. Now, 20 years later, almost to the month, that same man was about to buy the entire company. The deal was done with a state-backed holding company called GEPI. Alejandro put in symbolic capital. The Italian government put in everything else. On paper, it looked like a rescue. In reality, a mechanic had bought his old factory. The man who used to clock in at 6 in the morning and tighten bolts for 40 hours a week now owned the building, the brand, the Trident logo, and every engineer who used to walk past him without saying hello. This was the moment Alejandro de Tomaso became something more than a car maker. He became a legend in Modena. And by 1974, somewhere in this whirlwind of empire building, his Pantera had quietly traveled across the Atlantic and ended up in the hands of one specific American, a man named Elvis Presley. You already know how this part begins. A summer night in Memphis, a fight with his girlfriend, Linda Thompson, a yellow Pantera that refused to start, and a Colt 45. But here is the part nobody tells you. Elvis fired the first shot in frustration. The bullet tore through the steering wheel. Then his friend George Klein walked into the garage and asked what had happened. Elvis, annoyed at having to explain himself, fired a second shot into the floorboard. And the engine that had refused to start 10 minutes earlier, started. The Pantera roared to life, exhaust filling the garage, as Elvis stared at the bullet holes in his own car. That Pantera is now in the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. The bullet holes are still there. 2 scars in an Italian supercar, fired by an American king, driven by an Argentine builder's machine, into automotive folklore forever. Alejandro de Tomaso never met Elvis. He probably never knew that his car had become a piece of rock and roll history. By 1975, he didn't have time to care. He was running an empire. Ghia, Vignale, Benelli, Moto Guzzi, Innocenti, Maserati, De Tomaso Automobili. 7 companies, thousands of employees, factories scattered across northern Italy. And for the next decade, he would be untouchable. Until, sometime in the 1980s, the empire began to crack. In 1981, Alejandro de Tomaso made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to make Maserati popular. For 60 years, Maserati had been a name whispered in racing paddocks. Hand-built, exclusive, expensive. Alejandro looked at it and saw a different future. He wanted to build a Maserati that a doctor in Milan could afford. A Maserati that competed with BMW. A Maserati for the masses. He called it the B-Turbo, a small, twin-turbocharged V6 coupe that cost a fraction of what a real Maserati had ever cost. In its first year, it outsold every Maserati ever made, combined. The Italian press called it a miracle. The American press called it a disaster. Because the B-Turbo had a problem. It broke. It broke constantly. Turbochargers failed at 30,000 miles. Carburetors flooded in cold weather. Electrical systems shorted out and caught fire, sometimes literally. By 1986, American Maserati owners were filing lawsuits. By 1989, Maserati had pulled out of the United States entirely. The brand Alejandro had saved in 1975, the brand he had bled to keep alive, was now a punchline. For 30 years, Alejandro had won every fight. He had outrun a government. He had outbuilt Carroll Shelby. He had outmaneuvered Henry Ford. He had outlasted a dying industry. But he could not outrun this. Quality is not won in a meeting room. Quality is won on 1,000 small decisions made by 1,000 workers every single day. And Alejandro had been too busy buying companies to fix the cars inside them. By 1989, he was negotiating with Chrysler, trying to find an American partner who could rescue Maserati again. The talks fell apart. In 1991, his empire began to sell itself off. Innocenti went to Fiat. Fiat shut it down. Maserati was the last to go. In 1993, after 18 years of fighting to keep it alive, Alejandro signed Maserati over to Fiat. The mechanic who had bought his old factory sold it back. 2 weeks later, in a quiet morning at his home in Modena, Alejandro de Tomaso did not get out of bed. He had suffered a massive stroke. He survived. But the man who walked out of that hospital was not the man who had walked in. His speech slowed. His right side weakened. The energy that had built an empire across 2 continents was gone. His son Santiago took over the day-to-day running of De Tomaso Automobili. Alejandro never built another car. He spent the next 10 years in his Modena villa, in a chair by a window, looking out at the city that had taken in a refugee in 1955 and made him a king. In May 2003, Alejandro de Tomaso died at the age of 74. He had not set foot in Argentina in 48 years. The country that had wanted to arrest him in 1955, the country he had once run an entire empire to forget, issued no statement. The Italian press called him the last of the great Modenese builders. The Trident logo he once owned, the trident his old factory now wore again, was the only crown he had ever truly wanted. In 2024, a 1971 De Tomaso Pantera sold at auction in Monterey for over $400,000. 50 years earlier, the same car had cost $10,000 on a Lincoln-Mercury showroom floor. The Mangusta, the car that had declared war on Carroll Shelby, now trades for over $500,000. Today, Maserati builds more cars in a single year than Alejandro de Tomaso owned in his entire life. The Trident is still on every one of them. In Modena, there is a small park named after him. A bronze plaque. A few flowers sometimes. Most people who walk past it have no idea who he was. In Argentina, silence. The country that wanted to arrest him in 1955 has never built him a monument. There is no street, no museum, no holiday. The cattle empire he was born into is still there, in the family name. But the family stopped speaking about him a long time ago. Alejandro de Tomaso was never an Italian. He was never American, never French, never German, though he built cars with all of them. He was an outsider in every country he ever stood in. And maybe that's why he could see what the insiders couldn't. A Texan with a cobra needed to be answered with a mongoose. A Detroit billionaire who hated Ferrari needed an Argentine in Modena to humiliate them for him. A bankrupt French company called Maserati needed someone with nothing to lose to save it. Insiders build careers. Outsiders rewrite industries. Alejandro de Tomaso was an outsider, and for 30 years, he rewrote one of the most protected industries on earth. Then he sold it back. Maserati, the company that paid him 80,000 lire a month in 1955. The company he bought, rescued, ran, and finally let go of in 1993, is still alive today. But the Maserati that walked out of his hands in 1993 was not the Maserati that walked in. Something had changed. Something had been broken in those 18 years. And the story of what happened to Maserati after Alejandro let it go is the story of one of the most spectacular collapses in modern automotive history. We'll tell that one next time.